What if I told you that, just minutes before midnight, Buckingham Palace pressed send on a message so urgent, so carefully worded, and so emotionally charged that even longtime royal insiders described it as the kind you hope you never have to write? A message that didn't go through the usual press channels. A message that bypassed comms staff who were already off the clock. A message that arrived like a thunderclap, sudden, cold, and unmistakably serious. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And here's the real question. Why did the palace break decades of protocol to share an update they could have easily kept private? Why now? Why this tone? And why the chilling phrase, intensive observation? A phrase so rarely used publicly that archivists had to dig back through the records to find the last time it appeared. Let me ask you, when was the last time you saw Buckingham Palace sound afraid? Because tonight, fictionally, in our narrative, they did. The late-night announcement didn't include symptoms. It didn't include a diagnosis. It didn't even mention the cause of the sudden medical intervention. Instead, it used two words the palace almost never puts together: sudden and intensive. You can feel the tension in that combination, can't you? Short, sharp, deliberate. Like a sentence that's been rewritten 20 times until only the coldest version remains. And the line that followed, details remain deeply personal, only fueled the fire. What details? Personal to whom? And why does the palace want the public to know something happened, but doesn't want them to know what happened? Audience question. If you received a message like that about someone you cared about, wouldn't your heart drop? Now picture the United Kingdom, millions of people, reading that same message all at once. Phones buzzing on bedside tables, television networks scrambling, reporters jolted awake by editors yelling across newsrooms, and the collective gasp that follows when everyone realizes the subject of the announcement. Prince William, the future king, the man being groomed for the crown for nearly 40 years, the stabilizing force in a turbulent royal era, the one person almost no one expected to see in a medical headline like this. But here's where the story gets even more unsettling. And this is the part the public never hears, the part that the palace only whispers about behind closed doors. This wasn't the first time staff had concerns that day. Hours earlier, according to our fictionalized narrative, aides noticed something unusual. A shift in schedule. A set of meetings suddenly rearranged. A convoy that changed direction. A few unusually tense exchanges in hallways. Small details. Tiny red flags. Moments that don't mean much on their own. Until later, when you realize they were the first dominoes. Have you ever felt that eerie sense that something is about to go wrong, even before it does? That quiet, creeping tension that settles into a room like fog? That's the atmosphere witnesses described. But here's the contradiction that grabs the audience's attention. Prince William had appeared completely fine earlier that day, smiling, composed, focused, carrying out his duties like the public figure he's trained to be. So how do you go from perfectly fine to intensive observation in a matter of hours? That's the question that rattled everyone awake. And yet, something doesn't add up. Because the palace didn't rush to share the news. They waited. Why? What were they hoping would change? Who were they waiting for? And why did staff describe the mood inside Kensington Palace as tense but strangely quiet, as though everyone was holding their breath? Let's pause here for a moment. Think about the royal family for a second. Think about how polished they are, how carefully they craft their words, how rarely they speak without full control of the narrative. So when they choose a phrase as dramatic and unpolished as intensive observation, you know the situation, fictionally, isn't routine. Because if everything was normal, if this was simply another medical check or standard precaution, the palace has a standard line they've used for decades. The prince is resting and in good spirits. But they didn't write that. Not even close. Instead, they released a message that left a cold gap, a hole where reassurance should have been. A message written to notify, not comfort. And the most haunting part? According to insiders, there was a debate about whether to release anything at all. Imagine that meeting. Imagine the advisors sitting around a long wooden table, weighing the possible outcomes. Silence thick in the room. Phones buzzing with half-updated information. Everyone wondering if they're about to trigger panic or calm it. Nobody quite sure which direction the night will go. What does it take for Buckingham Palace to break protocol? What level of urgency forces their hand? What information, withheld from the public, tipped the scales? Because let's be honest, sudden doesn't describe a pre-planned checkup. Intensive doesn't describe something mild. And deeply personal doesn't describe anything routine. But maybe the most human part of this story, the emotional heartbeat under the polished royal language, is the one person who wasn't at Buckingham Palace when all this unfolded. Catherine. She wasn't in the same location as William. She wasn't at the palace when the message was drafted. She wasn't anywhere near the medical team. So the question becomes, when was she told? How was she told? And what exactly did she hear? You can imagine her expression when the call came through. The stillness, the shock, the breath that catches in the chest before reality sinks in, the instinct to drop everything and go. But here's the contradiction, and contradictions keep viewers glued to the screen. The message Catherine received wasn't the same as the one released to the public. Think about that. Two versions of the same story. One for the family, one for the world. Why? What was in the private version? And who decided the public wasn't ready to hear it? Let's pull back for a moment and zoom out. Every royal event, fictionalized or not, ripples outward. Through staff, through advisors, through security, through the monarchy itself. But when the heir to the throne faces a sudden medical crisis, that ripple becomes a wave. A wave that hits the king. A wave that hits the government. A wave that hits international media. A wave that hits the public consciousness with a single chilling realization. Nothing about the future is guaranteed. And if tonight's announcement doesn't prove that, nothing will. But the introduction isn't just about the statement. It's about the silence before it. The hesitation. The minutes ticking past midnight. The decision to reveal only fragments. It's about a moment in time when everyone, even the palace, wasn't sure what would happen next. And that brings us to the real hook, the detail the palace did not include, the detail that transforms this from a medical update into something much stranger. The announcement wasn't supposed to go out tonight. It was scheduled for the morning. But something changed. Something shifted. Something triggered a last-minute scramble. And now the question becomes, what happened behind closed doors in those final minutes that forced Buckingham Palace to break their own timeline and release a message that sent the world into panic? That answer, fictional, dramatic, and far more chilling than anyone expected, begins in Chapter 1. Because the real story doesn't start with the announcement. It starts just moments before it. In the quiet. In the corridors. In the room where a decision was made that no one saw coming. And what came next would change everything. And no one was prepared for it. What if the real story didn't begin with the announcement, but with the moment right before it? The moment when a single knock on a door inside Kensington Palace shattered the controlled calm the royals had maintained all day? What if the true turning point wasn't the late-night statement, but the sound of one staff member's voice, trembling slightly as they whispered that something had changed? And here's the chilling part. According to those who witnessed it in our fictional narrative, the atmosphere in that hallway shifted instantly. 1 second, there was routine. The next, panic wrapped itself around the air like a cold hand. You ever feel a room tighten, even before anyone says the words you dread? That's what insiders described. That eerie moment when everyone senses something is wrong, even before they hear it. Because here's the truth no one expected. The final decision to send out the emergency announcement wasn't made by a large team or a committee. It was made by a single person who stepped forward, voice quiet but firm, and said, "We can't wait any longer." And those 5 words, spoken in a hallway where portraits of past monarchs stared down like silent witnesses, set into motion a chain of events that no one, not even senior advisors, had predicted. Think about that. A centuries-old institution. A meticulously maintained system. A palace known for caution, control, and tradition. Yet in this moment, everything boiled down to one voice saying it was time. That's not normal for the palace. That's not routine. That's not how things are supposed to work. And yet, in the most royal of ways, the unexpected suddenly became the only option. Now imagine the scene more closely. Kensington Palace, usually a picture of composed order, suddenly pulsing with urgency. Lights flickering on in rooms that had been dark minutes before. Footsteps echoing down marble hallways. Staff members emerging from offices, still buttoning jackets or adjusting ties, because the message that spread through the building didn't come with details. It only came with urgency. No one knew exactly what happened to William yet. They only knew it was serious. They only knew he had been taken under intensive observation. And if you've ever seen a group of trained professionals who are taught to remain calm, suddenly not calm, you know something big is coming. But what if I told you that even with all this chaos, there was one room in the palace where silence took over? A room where senior aides were gathered around a long table, staring at a draft of a statement they had hoped they wouldn't need? A room where the weight of uncertainty pressed so heavily against the walls that no one dared to speak first? They had written a version earlier in the evening, just in case. A draft meant for the morning. A draft they expected to revise, soften, sanitize. But then came the knock, the whispered update, the decision that changed everything. Suddenly, the morning draft felt outdated, insufficient, too calm for what was unfolding. So the aides looked at it again. They tightened the language, cut out the soft edges, and left the words that would jolt anyone awake. Sudden, intensive, deeply personal. But here's the contradiction that keeps viewers hooked. If the situation was so urgent, why didn't they include any specifics? Why the secrecy? Why the half-story? Why the suddenness paired with silence? It's like telling someone there's a fire, but refusing to say where it started. You create panic, but deny the information required to calm it. And contradictions like that are never accidental inside the palace. Every word is weighed. Every line is analyzed. Every phrase is tested for impact. So when senior staff remove details instead of adding them, you know the truth, in this fictional narrative, is heavier than the statement suggests. Let me ask you this. Have you ever read something that made your heart stop for a moment because the phrasing seemed wrong? Too careful? Too vague? That's how millions of people felt when they read the words intensive observation. It didn't say monitoring. It didn't say routine assessment. It didn't say as a precaution. It said intensive, a word that sounds clinical, cold, urgent. It creates a picture in your mind whether you want it or not. And the palace knew that. They knew exactly how it would be interpreted, which is why the silence that followed, the refusal to elaborate, felt like a second shockwave. But the part almost no one heard about was what happened 3 minutes before that statement went out. 3 minutes. Think about how short that is. Think about what can really happen in 3 minutes. Not much, right? But inside that palace room, 3 minutes changed everything. A phone buzzed. Not loudly, not dramatically. A single vibration. Enough to make everyone look up. Enough to make one aide's face drain of color. Enough to send a wave of tension through the room so thick it felt like the walls leaned in. Whatever was on that phone wasn't shared with the entire table, not at first. Only 2 people saw it. They both lowered their heads. One whispered something. The other nodded. And that was all it took. The statement, the one no one wanted to send tonight, suddenly became non-negotiable. Now, here's where the contradictions twist deeper. The staff in the building still didn't know what happened. Some thought William had experienced something earlier in the day. Others assumed it was a late-night complication. 1 or 2 quietly wondered if this had been developing longer than anyone admitted. But no one knew for sure. They only received fragments. And fragments create fear. Because when you don't have the whole picture, your mind fills in the gaps with things far worse than reality. Why do you think the palace avoids vagueness? Because vague information spreads faster than truth. It fuels whispers. It ignites speculation. And right now, in our narrative, speculation inside Kensington Palace was building like a storm cloud. But the real emotional punch of this moment didn't happen in the palace. It happened miles away, where Catherine was when she received the call. The private call. The personal call. The call that didn't match the public announcement. And if you've ever had a moment where your life suddenly split into before and after, you know exactly what her heart must have done. The stillness. The cold rush of adrenaline. The desperate need to get to William immediately. That single breath where the world goes silent except for the one sentence replaying in your mind. The moment where duty, motherhood, fear, and love all collide at once. And yet, here's the contradiction. She couldn't move instantly. She needed to be briefed. She needed to speak to someone. She needed to follow a process even though her instincts were screaming to run. And while Catherine was absorbing her world-altering news, something else was happening back at the palace that staff still whisper about. A security officer, calm, trained, stoic, stepped into the communications room and said, "It's time." Those two words, so simple, carried the entire weight of the royal future in them. Nobody questioned him. Nobody argued. They all knew. Whatever had changed moments ago, whatever was shared in that silent phone notification, meant there was no more waiting. The announcement had to go out. Not to reassure, not to clarify, but to prepare the world for the unknown. And as the message was finally sent, a strange hush fell over the room. Not relief, not clarity, something more complicated. The awareness that once the world knew, nothing could be taken back. And the palace, for the first time in a long time, wasn't controlling the narrative. They were reacting to it. And that is something they fear. Here's the twist. The announcement wasn't the biggest shock of the night. It wasn't the moment that shook the palace to its core. There was something else. Something that happened right after the statement went live. Something staff didn't expect to unfold the way it did. And it's this event that marks the true beginning of the crisis. Because just as the announcement hit screens around the world, something, or someone, arrived at Kensington Palace that forced everyone to look up and whisper the same three words. He's here now. And what came next would change everything. Have you ever felt the air in a room change before you even turn your head to see who entered? That instinctive tightening in your chest, the moment when your mind whispers that something important just shifted? That is what every staff member inside Kensington Palace reportedly felt the moment those three words were spoken. He's here now. The type of sentence that doesn't need a subject because everyone already knows who he is. The type of moment when reality rearranges itself around a single arrival. And in our fictional narrative, that arrival wasn't the king. It wasn't Harry. It wasn't a senior advisor or a doctor or even a bodyguard. It was someone whose presence made the entire room fall silent. Someone who had not been expected, not at this hour, not in the middle of a crisis, and certainly not before anyone had publicly acknowledged the severity of William's condition. Because standing at the entrance, calm but visibly burdened, was the palace medical director, the man who doesn't appear unless circumstances have crossed a line from manageable to critical. And the moment his silhouette appeared in the doorway, every advisor who had spent hours preparing the statement suddenly understood why they had been instructed to release it immediately. This wasn't protocol anymore. This wasn't messaging or PR or royal optics. This was something real, something urgent, something that carried the weight of mortality, that quiet, terrifying shadow that hovers over every human life, regardless of title or bloodline. And here's the part that hits hardest. None of the senior staff in the room spoke. Not one. They simply watched as the director stepped forward, closed the door behind him with a soft click, and placed a single folder on the table. A folder that looked far too thin to contain anything devastating, and yet somehow felt heavier than anything they had held before. Have you ever seen people brace themselves without being told to? As if everyone's body recognizes the gravity before the mind can catch up? That's what happened. Shoulders straightened, breath stilled, fingers tightened around pins even though no one was writing. And then came the sentence that changed the temperature of the room. We need to discuss the next steps. Not he's stable. Not we have good news. Not even there's been a development. Just that chilling phrase, the one medical professionals use when something has escalated beyond immediate reassurance. And the contradiction here is impossible to ignore. The palace had just released a statement saying details were deeply personal, implying privacy, care, and boundaries. Yet inside this room, privacy wasn't an option. Decisions had to be made. Protocol had to be followed. Preparations had to begin for outcomes no one wanted to imagine. And if you've ever felt trapped in a moment where you're desperately searching for a better answer but none exists, then you know exactly how that room felt. The director opened the folder. Slowly, intentionally, as if even the paper inside needed a moment of silence. And the first page revealed something none of the advisors expected. A timeline. A precise, minute-by-minute chronology of William's condition over the past several hours. The kind of document prepared only when a situation is serious enough that multiple teams need the same information at the same time. It listed symptoms, responses, medical interventions, changes in vital signs, all laid out with clinical clarity. And here's the twist that makes everyone watching lean closer. According to the fictional account, the timeline contradicted several assumptions the palace had been operating under. Because the situation hadn't started late that evening, as most staff believed. It had begun much earlier. Imagine that realization. The shock, the confusion, the quiet ripple of dread that comes when you realize something has been unfolding beneath the surface for longer than anyone admitted. Advisors exchanged glances, not out of blame, but out of fear. Fear that they had underestimated the urgency. Fear that the king didn't yet know the full picture. Fear of how the public would interpret the silence if they ever found out just how long the situation had been developing. And this contradiction, the difference between what the palace believed and what was actually happening, is what lit the fuse for everything that followed. The director's voice was steady, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. "We're not in immediate crisis," he said, "but we are in a phase that requires total clarity." Think about that. Not immediate crisis. Yet everyone in the room could tell that phrase was fragile, a thin veneer placed over something deeply alarming. Because people who are not in crisis do not require intensive observation. They do not require private briefings at midnight. They do not require folders filled with timelines and protocols. So, audience question. What do you think total clarity means in a situation like this? Transparency? Urgency? Preparation? Or all three at once? But before anyone could ask, before anyone could gather their thoughts, before anyone could even exhale, something else happened. Something that revealed the emotional undercurrent driving the entire night. The director closed the folder, placed both hands on the table, and said quietly, "His family needs to be prepared." And that sentence, soft, calm, measured, was the one that hit hardest. Because it didn't refer to the public. It didn't refer to advisors. It meant Catherine. It meant Charles. It meant the children sleeping in their beds. It meant Harry and Ocean away. It meant the private circle of people who love William beyond his title. And the contradiction between the palace's public calm and the private anxiety behind closed doors grew sharper, deeper, more impossible to ignore. But the room wasn't finished absorbing this revelation before another shock arrived. Another knock at the door. Another unexpected visitor. Another pivot in the night's trajectory. This time, it wasn't a doctor or aide. It was security. The head of security, in fact. A man not known for emotion, not known for hesitation, not known for entering rooms unless he is explicitly summoned. And yet here he was, requesting an urgent word with the director. The exchange was brief, whispered, tense. And though the advisors couldn't hear the words, they could read the expressions, tightening jawlines, furrowed brows, short, sharp nods. Something was happening outside the room. Something they weren't supposed to hear yet. Something that made the director close the folder again, straighten his posture, and say, "We need to move." You ever watch a moment unfold without understanding the details, but knowing instinctively that something monumental is happening just beyond your reach? That's what this was. A shift, a pivot, a signal that whatever was happening with Prince William was evolving in real time, moment by moment, too quickly for the palace to hide behind protocol or delay. And then came the detail that truly shook the advisors. The director revealed that the phrase intensive observation had not been the palace's choice. It had been his. He insisted on it. Why? Because, in his words, anything softer would be irresponsible. That single sentence reframed the entire night. It meant the palace had wanted gentler wording. It meant the comms team had tried to cushion the message. It meant the instinct, even in crisis, had been to preserve royal image before public clarity. And yet, in the end, the truth won. The harsher phrase stayed. And the reality behind it was far more serious than anyone outside the palace realized. But here's the twist that deepens the tension. The director still hadn't explained why the situation was so sensitive. He hadn't described what triggered the shift. He hadn't shared the detail that made intensive observation necessary. And the advisors were afraid to ask. Not because they didn't want answers, but because part of them feared the answers would be worse than their imaginations. Have you ever been in a moment where silence feels safer than truth? That was this room. Then, without warning, the director said something that froze every breath in the room. "There's another matter you need to be aware of." He didn't specify. He didn't elaborate. He simply placed a second envelope on the table. This one unmarked, sealed, and much heavier than the folder before it. And with a single gesture, he pushed it forward. "This didn't come from us," he said quietly, "but you need to read it." What was in the envelope? Who sent it? Why did it arrive at that exact moment? And why did the director look so concerned? The advisor stared at it, unsure whether to open it or leave it sealed. And that hesitation, that moment where everyone realized they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than they expected, became the true turning point of the night. Because once that envelope was opened, nothing would ever be the same again. And what was inside was only the beginning. What if the most unsettling moments in life aren't the ones filled with noise and chaos, but the ones wrapped in silence? The kind of silence that stretches so thin you can feel it vibrating in the air. That was the silence inside the briefing room as the unmarked envelope sat on the table like a living pulse, radiating tension into every corner of the room. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even shifted in their chair. It was the kind of moment where the instinct to look around the room and confirm that everyone is seeing what you're seeing becomes overpowering. But even that was impossible, because everyone was busy staring at the same object, the one thing in the room that wasn't supposed to exist. In the palace, nothing arrives unannounced. Nothing appears without being catalogued, logged, signed for, or escorted. And yet here it was. An envelope with no seal, no insignia, no markings, just a smooth white surface holding something important enough that the medical director insisted they open it immediately. Think about that. For a man trained to deal with emergencies, trained to keep calm in the harshest storm, trained to speak with precise caution, for him to bring this envelope into the room spoke volumes about what might be inside. But the fear wasn't about the envelope. It was about timing. Because in our fictional narrative, the envelope had arrived not earlier in the day, not during a scheduled briefing, not with the usual morning mail. It had arrived minutes after the palace confirmed that Prince William was under intensive observation. Minutes, which meant whoever sent it knew something. Which meant someone outside this room had information the palace did not yet possess. And that realization, the realization that the palace was no longer the central holder of knowledge, caused a ripple of panic that no one dared put into words. Because when the monarchy loses control over information, even for a moment, everything begins to unravel. The director didn't push them. He didn't pressure them. He simply gestured to the envelope and stepped back, giving the advisors space to make their choice. And that choice felt like a cliff's edge. Imagine sitting at that table. Imagine knowing that whatever lies inside could either clarify everything or complicate everything 10 times over. Imagine knowing that opening it might reveal something you're not prepared to handle. But imagine, too, the fear of not opening it. The fear of missing the one piece of information that could change the entire trajectory of the night. That's where they were trapped. Between the truth and the unknown. Between protocol and instinct. Between duty and dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one advisor, the oldest in the room, the one who had served under 3 monarchs, reached forward. His fingers hovered above the envelope for a moment, trembling just slightly, as though his body was warning him to stop. But he didn't. With a slow inhale, he slid a finger under the flap and began to open it. And at that moment, every person in the room leaned forward, breaths held, hearts pounding. It's strange how something so small, so mundane, like the sound of paper tearing, can suddenly feel catastrophic. But that's what it was. The first tear felt like a spark in a room filled with gas. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. 1 page. Not thick. Not formal. Not ceremonially prepared. Plain paper covered in neat, tight handwriting. No signature. No sender. No official stamp. Just words. Raw, focused, urgent. And the first line made the advisor reading it freeze so completely that the others thought he'd gone pale. He passed the page to the next advisor without saying a word. And as it made its way around the table, the reaction was the same. A tightening jaw here, a widening of eyes there, a sharp inhale, a hand pressing hard against the table for grounding. Whatever was written on that sheet wasn't just alarming. It was personal. It referenced timelines. It referenced earlier observations. It referenced something that had happened before the palace even realized the situation was deteriorating. And if you're wondering how someone outside the palace could know those details, that was the question that lodged itself into every advisor's mind like a cold blade. But here's the contradiction that turns everything upside down. The letter didn't accuse anyone. It didn't make claims. It didn't present rumors disguised as facts. It presented something far more chilling, a warning. A calm, precise, eerily confident warning. And here's where the emotional tension spikes. The warning suggested that what William was experiencing wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of something building beneath the surface, something unnoticed, overlooked, or underestimated. It mentioned a pattern, a subtle shift in behavior, a detail so small that only someone paying very close attention would have spotted it. And the letter implied, without stating it outright, that the palace had missed the signs. Imagine the weight of that implication landing on a table full of people who are trained to protect the future king. The guilt, the frustration, the fear, the creeping realization that someone outside the palace had been paying closer attention to William than the people inside it. And imagine the fury that would rise within you if you realized that someone you don't know is watching the heir to the throne closely enough to predict a medical crisis before it happens. But the letter didn't stop there. No, the twist came in the last paragraph. A paragraph that made the advisors sit back in shock, stare at one another in disbelief, and whisper the same question. How could they know this? Because the final lines referenced something the palace hadn't told anyone. Something that had occurred earlier that evening. Something only a handful of people had been informed of. A detail so sensitive that even the medical team had been instructed to keep it quiet until further evaluation. And yet, whoever wrote this letter knew. They knew the timing. They knew the urgency. They knew the internal debate happening inside the palace. And they knew the phrase that had caused the entire communication team to freeze in fear. Let me ask you a direct question. How would you feel if someone outside your inner circle referenced a conversation you thought only 4 people had heard? Would you feel watched? Exposed? Vulnerable? That's what the palace advisors felt. And that fear began to outgrow the fear of the medical situation itself. The director finally broke the silence. This shouldn't be possible. He said it without emotion, but the tremor beneath his words betrayed him. He wasn't just confused. He was rattled. And for someone in his position, someone who rarely shows uncertainty, that rattling was a sign no one could ignore. He asked, "Who else has seen this?" The advisors looked at one another. The security officer returned. The envelope was inspected, stamped, lifted to the light. No clue, no trace, no indication of origin. Just a message that shouldn't exist, but did. And then came the part that shifted the entire night into a new direction. The final line of the letter wasn't a warning. It was a prediction. A calm, almost gentle statement written with eerie certainty. You will need to prepare the family sooner than you think. That was the moment the temperature in the room dropped. That was the moment every advisor realized this wasn't just a medical crisis. This was something larger, something connected, something that blurred the line between private concern and something far more unsettling. But the biggest twist wasn't the letter itself. It wasn't the warning. It wasn't the prediction. It wasn't the knowledge it contained. The biggest twist was the realization that someone else, somewhere outside this palace, already knew what the advisors themselves were only now discovering. And the moment that truth sank in, the medical director's phone buzzed again. One new message, one new update, one new shift in the night. He looked at the screen. His face changed, and what he said next would send the entire palace into a silent freefall. What if the words that can destroy a night don't come in shouts, alarms, or explosions, but in a whisper, quiet enough that you almost doubt you heard them, yet powerful enough to rearrange the atmosphere around you? That's exactly what happened the moment the medical director lowered his phone and spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He didn't rush. Instead, he said the one sentence no one in Kensington Palace thought they'd hear that night. The one sentence that made every advisor sit up straighter and every breath in the room turn shallow. He's asking for his wife. And though those words seemed simple, even gentle, everyone present knew what they meant in context. William, the future king, the calmest member of the family, the man who always downplays his struggles and never wants to worry others, was lucid enough to make a request. But that request, made under intensive observation, carried an emotional weight that sent a shiver through every person in the room. Because in moments of deep uncertainty, people ask for the person they feel safest with. And when someone like William asks for Catherine, it means one thing: he's afraid. That was the moment when the palace's polished exterior cracked, when the advisors stopped thinking like strategists and started thinking like people. Because no title, no crown, no centuries-old institution is insulated from that raw human fear. And the contradiction hit them all at once. Outside the palace walls, millions of people were refreshing news screens, trying to decipher the meaning behind the vague announcement. While inside the palace, the situation had just crossed an invisible line. William wasn't only being observed. He was scared enough to ask for the one person who steadies him. And Catherine wasn't there. You could feel the dread spread across the room. Thick, heavy, suffocating. One advisor rubbed his forehead, trying to mask the tremor in his hand. Another stared at the floor as though he could will the situation to reverse. The director, usually composed, tightened his jaw, a tiny movement, but enough to tell everyone that this request wasn't routine. Audience question: have you ever experienced that moment when someone strong, someone unshakable, suddenly sounds vulnerable? Isn't it terrifying? Isn't it the moment you realize things are far worse than you thought? But while the advisors were frozen in shock, Catherine was miles away, unaware that her presence was no longer optional. She was necessary. And here's the emotional twist that deepens the story. Her phone was already ringing. Not once, not twice, multiple times. But because of the hour, because she'd stepped into a quiet room to gather herself after the first briefing, she hadn't heard the first calls. The phone sat on a nearby table, vibrating silently, the screen glowing in the dim light, each missed call stacking upon the last. Her name illuminated the dark, a still image in a night already spinning out of control. When she finally returned to the room and saw the notifications, her heart dropped in that sharp, stomach-turning way that tells you the news is not good. She picked up the phone with trembling fingers, bracing herself. And when she answered, she didn't even say hello. She just whispered, "What happened?" Because that's what we do when fear outruns formality. We skip the greetings. We go straight to the truth. And the voice on the other end didn't soften anything, didn't cushion the blow, didn't pretend this was routine. They simply said, "He's asking for you. You need to come now." The world around her seemed to freeze. That single moment, the moment Catherine heard those words, felt like a drop in time. The room around her blurred. The air tightened. The weight of those words pressed down on her chest. Yet somehow, even with panic twisting inside her, she didn't crumble. She didn't break. She became still, intensely still, the way people get when they understand they're entering a moment that will be etched in their memory forever. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and said, "I'm coming," with a steadiness that contradicted the terror inside her. Meanwhile, back at Kensington Palace, the advisors watched the director with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What does that mean for his condition?" one finally asked, voice low, almost pleading. The director hesitated, and that hesitation said everything. In the palace, silence is often more revealing than words. It means the truth is complicated, delicate, or too painful to speak plainly. But eventually, he answered, and his words were even more unsettling. "He's aware, but his levels are unstable." The advisors exchanged horrified glances. Unstable, another vague but powerful word. A word that doesn't offer answers but demands questions. A word that sits like ice in your bloodstream. Here's where the emotional stakes intensify. The advisors weren't just thinking about William's well-being anymore. They were thinking about Catherine. Because they knew the moment she arrived, she would be stepping into a situation she wasn't prepared for. They imagined her walking down the quiet corridor toward the observation room. They imagined her seeing him there, pale, frightened, vulnerable. They imagined her holding his hand, trying to stay strong while everything around her felt like it was falling apart. And that image, that private, heartbreaking image, made even the most seasoned advisor's eyes glisten. But the night wasn't done twisting. Because just as they were preparing transportation for Catherine, just as security teams were mapping the fastest, most protected route to the palace, something else happened. Something that shifted the emotional temperature even deeper into fear. A second message appeared on the medical director's phone. Short, urgent, and when he read it, his expression changed again. This time not to concern, but to alarm. He stepped closer to the table and said, "There's been another development." That sentence alone made two advisors stand up instinctively. Humans rise when danger feels close. It's an instinct older than civilization. The director continued, "He's conscious, but disoriented. The room erupted into a flurry of hushed voices, questions overlapping, fears spilling out in fractured pieces. But the director lifted his hand, silencing them. He asked for Catherine again. And then he asked, "What time is it?" That detail struck them hard. Why? Because asking, "What time is it?" can be a sign of confusion, fear, or an attempt to ground oneself when reality feels unstable. And for a man as sharp, composed, and mentally strong as William, disorientation was not a word the palace wanted to hear. But even that wasn't the most alarming part of the message. The true twist, the detail that sent a ripple of dread through the room, came in the final line of the update. "He keeps repeating something." The advisors leaned in. Their breath caught. "What is he repeating?" one asked in a whisper. The director shook his head slowly. "We're not sure yet." They couldn't make it out completely, but it sounded like he was trying to warn someone. Imagine hearing that. Imagine knowing that the heir to the throne, while under intensive medical observation, might be trying to communicate a warning. Imagine the dread that blossoms from that possibility. What was he warning them about? What detail did he register that no one else had? Was it fear, memory, instinct, or something else entirely? And here's where the contradiction hits like a hammer. The palace was trying desperately to control the narrative outside. Vague wording, tight-lipped statements, no details shared. While inside, the situation was deteriorating emotionally, medically, and psychologically. It was no longer about optics. It was about understanding what William was seeing, sensing, or remembering that made him repeat himself in confusion. But the true emotional storm was still heading toward the palace. Because Catherine, unaware of the new developments, was already en route. She was sitting in the back of a secure vehicle, gripping her hands tightly in her lap, staring out the window as streetlights flashed past like silent witnesses to the unfolding crisis. And her mind was racing, not with royal protocol, not with public perception, but with one question: what if I'm too late? She replayed William's voice in her mind, remembered the way he sounded earlier in the day. Strong, clear, steady. She tried to imagine what intensive observation looked like, tried to make sense of a situation that had unfolded too quickly for her to process. Her throat tightened, her chest ached, but she kept breathing, kept moving, kept forcing herself to stay calm, because she knew he needed her. Back at Kensington Palace, the advisors were preparing for her arrival. But just as the director moved toward the door to meet her, another alert echoed through the room, a discreet alarm that signaled an immediate update from the medical team. The director paused, checking the message, and when he looked up, every drop of composure he had left evaporated. He said only 4 words, 4 words that drained every remaining color from the advisors' faces. His levels dropped again. And then he added a 5th word, one that shattered whatever hope the advisors were still holding on to. Fast. What if the most terrifying part of a crisis isn't the moment things fall apart, but the moment right before, the moment when everything still looks normal on the surface, yet you sense the ground shifting beneath your feet? That was the exact sensation gripping the advisors, the medical director, and the security teams inside Kensington Palace the instant those 4 devastating words left the director's mouth. His levels dropped again. And then the final one, fast. The speed of the decline was the part that shook them. Not just a drop, not just instability, but speed. Speed means escalation. Speed means danger. Speed means control is slipping. And everyone in that room knew it. The director's voice trembled. Just barely, but enough. The advisors stared at him, waiting for clarification, but none came. He didn't need to explain what it meant. The room understood instinctively. Levels don't plummet like that without a trigger. Something had changed in William's condition. Something the medical team had hoped wouldn't happen. Something they had tried to prevent. And now the palace had to brace itself for the next phase. A phase they had feared from the moment the phrase intensive observation entered the conversation. But here's the contradiction that makes this moment so emotionally devastating. Less than an hour earlier, there had still been hope. Hope that this was merely precautionary. Hope that rest, tests, and monitoring would stabilize everything. Hope that by morning, the palace could release a calmer, clearer update. Hope that Catherine could arrive and find him steady, coherent, even smiling shakily in that way he does when he tries to reassure everyone else. That hope was fragile. but it was hope nonetheless. And now, it was slipping. And what magnified the fear tenfold was the timing. Because Catherine was already on her way. Already racing toward the palace with every light on the streets blurring past the car windows. Already imagining how she would sit beside him, take his hand, tell him he wasn't alone. She thought she was heading toward a moment of reunion. Painful, yes, but manageable. She had no idea she was now racing a clock. No idea his levels had dropped. No idea that the doctors were moving urgently, voices low and tense. No idea that the palace was preparing for possible outcomes that no one wanted to face. No idea that the advisors were no longer debating communication strategy. They were trying to figure out who needed to be summoned next. Back in the briefing room, the director lifted his phone again, scanning additional messages coming in from the medical team. The advisors held their breath. The room felt smaller by the second, the air heavier. Every sound, a cough, a shifting chair, a footstep in the hallway, seemed amplified. And then the director exhaled sharply and said, "They're stabilizing him, but it's fragile." Fragile. Another word no one wanted to hear. Fragile means temporary. Fragile means unpredictable. Fragile means one more drop could push everything into a territory the palace is never prepared to navigate. One advisor leaned forward, voice shaky, and asked the question they had all been thinking. Is he still conscious? The director hesitated, another crack in his composure, and replied, "Yes, but intermittent." Intermittent. The room froze at that word. Because intermittent consciousness means everything becomes unpredictable. It means disorientation, fear, fragmented awareness, gaps in memory. It means the person slipping in and out might be trying to communicate something important but can't fully express it. And suddenly, everyone remembered the earlier message, the detail they had tried to push down, the line that had chilled them hours ago. He keeps repeating something, a warning. But what was the warning? What was he trying to say? What truth was trapped behind his confusion? It was too much uncertainty. Too many layers of fear. Too many unanswered questions swirling around an heir to the throne whose life, both public and private, carries weight far beyond his own family. And yet, even in this moment, the palace faced another contradiction, one they had been trained to manage but never fully accepted. They had to remain calm. Outwardly, controlled, strategically silent, because they knew that by morning, the world would be demanding answers. Headlines would twist. Social media would detonate. Speculation would run wild. And if the palace didn't control the narrative, someone else would. But right now, narrative didn't matter. Protocol didn't matter. Media didn't matter. Only William mattered. And the fear of losing him, the raw, personal, devastating fear, was spreading faster than any update the medical team could send. And then came the next twist, the twist that shifted the entire emotional axis of the night. A young staff member, barely in her mid-20s, new to Kensington Palace, visibly shaken by the charged atmosphere, burst into the room. She didn't knock. She didn't wait. She just stepped inside, breathless, clutching a small tablet with a fresh update from the on-site medical team. The advisors turned toward her. The director stepped forward. She handed him the tablet with trembling hands and said, almost in a whisper, "You need to see this." The director scanned the message, stopped, scrolled back. "Read it again." His eyes widened, not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough to make the advisor's stomachs drop. He lowered the tablet, and for a moment, he looked older, exhausted, defeated. Then he delivered the update. He's asking questions. He's confused. He's asking about something that didn't happen tonight. The advisors exchanged horrified glances. Confusion is expected during medical instability, but confusion with specificity? Confusion tied to a memory? Confusion tied to a believed event? That was something else entirely. "What is he asking?" one advisor demanded, voice tight. The director hesitated. A dangerous hesitation. He's asking if something went wrong earlier today. He's asking if he collapsed before dinner. The room erupted in whispers. Collapsed before dinner? But that didn't happen. They would have known, wouldn't they? And here, in this moment, the letter from Chapter 3 came roaring back into relevance. The letter that suggested something had been unfolding longer than the palace realized. The letter that referenced signs missed earlier. The letter that predicted they would need to prepare the family sooner than they expected. Was William's confusion a symptom? Or was it memory? Had something actually happened earlier? Something the palace genuinely didn't know? Something he remembered, vaguely, shakily, as his body deteriorated? The contradictions were piling up. And contradictions create panic. Because when two conflicting truths collide, someone has to be wrong. But the emotional core of this moment wasn't the palace's confusion. It was Catherine's complete absence from this terrifying unraveling. She was still in the car, still racing through the city, still unaware that William's questions now suggested he believed something had gone wrong hours before anyone noticed. Still unaware that his condition wasn't just physical. It was disorienting his sense of time, memory, and reality. And then, as if the night wasn't already spiraling, William's mother was mentioned. The director read another line from the tablet and swallowed hard before speaking. He said her name. A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew who he meant. Diana. That name carries emotional weight for William even in the best circumstances. But in moments of confusion, fear, vulnerability, her memory becomes a symbol of loss, fragility, and the haunting awareness that life can change in an instant. He keeps saying, "She told me to rest." He keeps repeating it. The advisors stared at one another, frozen. What did that mean? A hallucination? A memory resurfacing? A fragmented dream? Or was he trying to communicate something deeper? Fear wrapped in symbolism? And here's where the tension snaps into something even sharper. Disorientation doesn't make people fabricate memories. It makes them cling to the strongest emotional anchors they possess. Diana was one of his strongest anchors, and the palace was running out of time. Finally, the security team announced Catherine was 5 minutes away. The advisors exhaled in shaky relief. The director straightened himself. Staff moved swiftly. Aides prepared the corridor. Doctors signaled readiness. Catherine would be stepping into this storm at any second. Stepping into a moment she could never forget. But those 5 minutes would prove to be the longest of her life. Because just as her car turned the final corner toward the palace gate, the medical director received one more alert. One sentence, one update, one line that made him go still. And when he looked up, his voice cracked as he spoke the words. He's not responding. What if the most devastating moments in life aren't the ones where someone screams or collapses or alarms go off, but the ones where everything suddenly becomes too quiet, unnervingly quiet, as if the world itself is holding its breath? That was the atmosphere that swallowed Kensington Palace the moment the medical director whispered those 3 crushing words. He's not responding. They echoed in the room, soft but lethal, sinking into the walls, into the floor, into the hearts of the advisors who had been clinging desperately to the fragile thread of hope that William's condition, though worsening, still had time to stabilize. But now, that thread snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with that quiet, devastating finality that leaves everyone staring at each other with the same hollow question in their eyes. What now? The advisors froze. Some looked at the director, others at the floor, but none of them knew what to say. Because what does a person do when the future they've been planning for, the carefully structured, meticulously maintained royal trajectory, suddenly feels like it's slipping straight through their fingers? One advisor tried to speak, but no sound came out. Another stood up instinctively, as if movement could somehow undo reality. A third covered his mouth with his hand, realizing for the first time that they were no longer watching a situation unfold, they were standing inside it. And at the center of it, the axis around which this entire night was spinning, was a man beloved by millions, the heir to the throne, lying in a room just floors away, unresponsive. The medical director swallowed hard, his voice tightening as he clarified, "He's breathing. His heart rate is present, but he's not responding." That small clarification did not bring relief. If anything, it deepened the fear, because unresponsiveness in a situation already labeled intensive observation could mean many things, none of them comforting. It meant William could hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing, or worse, it meant he was drifting in and out of consciousness so rapidly that he was unable to communicate. And that image, the image of him lying there, vulnerable, pale, detached from the world around him, stabbed through the room like a shard of ice. And here's the contradiction that made the entire moment unbearable. Catherine was seconds away from the palace. Seconds. Her car was pulling through the main gate at that very moment, security lights flaring across the windows, guards stepping aside, communication radios crackling to life. She had no idea the situation had changed again. No idea the man she was rushing toward had slipped into an unresponsive state. No idea she was arriving not into an emotional reunion, but into the most terrifying moment of the night. And the palace, unprepared for this exact overlap, suddenly found itself torn between two impossible tasks: preparing Catherine to see her husband in that condition, or shielding her until they knew more. Meanwhile, the medical director's phone buzzed again. A rapid, insistent vibration that made everyone in the room tense all over again. He checked the screen, eyes scanning faster, brow tightening, shoulders tensing, and whispered, "They're attempting stimulation." Several advisors exhaled shakily. Stimulation meant they were trying to bring him back, calling his name, touching his hand, applying gentle medical techniques to encourage responsiveness. No shouting, no shaking, just enough pressure to try to draw the person back to awareness. But the director's next sentence crushed whatever tiny relief they felt. He's not reacting. That detail landed like a blow. Not reacting means he wasn't responding to touch, not responding to sound, not responding to verbal cues, not responding to Catherine's name, repeated softly by the medical team, not responding even when one of the doctors gently pressed his shoulder, calling "sir," in a voice that tried, and failed, to hide its urgency. And the reality of that moment, the harsh truth of it, sent a wave of dread through the palace. And yet, here was the darker contradiction. The part that twisted deeper than everything else so far. Even in this frightening state, William was still speaking earlier. Confused, yes. Disoriented, yes. But speaking, asking about events that hadn't occurred, mentioning memories that didn't align with the timeline, repeating warnings no one understood, calling out his mother's name. And now silence. A silence so complete it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. What did that mean? Was it neurological? Psychological? A protective shutdown response. The advisors wanted answers, but the director only shook his head, because answers require clarity, and tonight was filled with fog. Outside the palace, Catherine's car stopped under the stone archway. Engines cut. Doors opened. Security stepped forward swiftly and silently. Catherine emerged quickly, her coat pulled tightly around her, her steps fast, controlled, her face pale but determined. She looked around, scanning the courtyard as if expecting someone. Anyone, to rush forward and tell her everything was fine. But no one did. Their silence was deafening, and Catherine felt it instantly. She wasn't walking into reassurance. She was walking into something far more frightening. The moment she stepped into the entrance corridor, the director of Kensington Palace Operations himself appeared, moving toward her with a somber urgency. His expression alone made her breath catch. She stopped walking. He approached slowly, carefully, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "We need to take you upstairs immediately," he said. "There have been developments." The word developments was a knife. Catherine felt her heart twist painfully in her chest, but she forced a nod, forced her legs to move, forced her mind to focus. She couldn't panic now. William needed her. The corridor leading to the observation room was dim, intentionally kept quiet to prevent panic, but tonight that calmness felt sinister. Each step echoed, long and hollow, as Catherine walked toward the door that separated her from the worst night of her life. And yet, even as she walked, even as she braced herself, she did not yet know that William was unresponsive. She believed, hoped, that he was still conscious enough to hear her voice, to see her face, to feel her hand on his. The advisors behind her knew the truth, but they couldn't break her heart in the hallway. Not like this. Not until she reached the door. Inside the briefing room, the advisors listened as the medical team's updates came faster, choppier, more frantic beneath the controlled language. The director turned to them with a grave look. "They need us," he said. And then, more urgently, "Now." He gestured toward the door, and the advisors followed, leaving behind the table, the devices, the letter, and every unanswered question swirling through the palace like a ghost. They entered the corridor just as Catherine reached the top of the stairs. She turned toward them, eyes wide, seeking clarity she desperately needed. But before anyone could speak, Before anyone could prepare her for the moment she was about to face, the door to William's room opened, and a doctor stepped out, his face pale, voice tight, urgency radiating off him in waves. "Where is she?" he asked. His eyes found Catherine immediately. She stepped forward. "I'm here." He swallowed hard. "You need to come inside now." Catherine felt her blood turn cold. "Is he awake?" The doctor hesitated. A brutal hesitation. Then finally, quietly, painfully, he said, "He's not responding to us." Catherine's world shattered. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't collapse. She simply froze, as if time itself had turned to stone around her. Her lips trembled. "What do you mean he's not responding?" The doctor didn't answer with words. He just stepped aside and held the door open. Catherine walked inside, and what she saw was worse than anything she had imagined. But the nightmare wasn't over. Because at that exact moment, as Catherine took her first step toward William, the medical director's phone vibrated again behind her. He glanced at the screen, and his entire body went rigid. This alert was not from the medical team. It was from security, and the message said, "We have a situation."